Police tell us he literally lived across the street inside of this apartment complex, and when they went in to arrest him, well, they made a gruesome discovery.
They discovered a deceased female on the floor in an advanced stage of decomposition.
Police officers burst through an apartment door, expecting to find a murder suspect, but instead they stumble upon something so horrifying, so utterly unthinkable, that even seasoned detectives are left speechless. Inside that apartment, hidden beneath the mundane trappings of everyday life, lies evidence of a crime so chilling that it would make history in Montgomery County, Maryland. But here's what nobody saw coming. The story truly begins on a cold December evening in 2022, when a seemingly ordinary dispute over an iced tea would spiral into a brutal execution-style killing that would shock an entire community. 31-year-old Tori Damian Moore walked into the Dash-In convenience store on New Hampshire Avenue in Silver Spring, Maryland, a store he had been explicitly banned from entering. The 61-year-old clerk working that night was Ayalu Wandimu, a hard-working man who had no idea that this routine shift would be his last moments on Earth.
The background here, prosecutors say, caught in dramatic surveillance video December 2022, Moore shot and killed a cashier at a convenience store on New Hampshire Avenue in Silver Spring. There was a dispute and Moore opened fire on the 61-year-old man in an execution-style murder.
What happened next was captured in horrifying detail by the store's surveillance cameras. Moore selected an iced tea. An argument erupted between him and Wandimu, and in a flash of rage, Moore threw items at the clerk. When Wandimu picked up a pole to defend himself, Moore made a decision that would seal both their fates. He pulled out a handgun and opened fire, shooting the defenseless clerk multiple times in what prosecutors would later describe as an execution-style murder. The violence was swift, merciless, and captured frame by frame on video that would later become crucial evidence in court. But here's where this story takes an absolutely devastating turn that nobody, not the responding officers, not the prosecutors, not even the most experienced detectives could have anticipated. Hours after the convenience store shooting, a SWAT team executed a no-knock search warrant at Moore's apartment, which was located directly across the street from the very store where Wandimu had been killed. They were there to arrest Moore for the clerk's murder, expecting a straightforward apprehension of a dangerous suspect. What they found inside that apartment would haunt them forever. The moment officers breached the door, they were immediately assaulted by an overwhelming, nauseating odor, the unmistakable smell of death and decomposition that had permeated every corner of the living space. As they moved deeper into the apartment, they discovered Moore sleeping calmly in the dining room, completely at ease despite the horror that surrounded him. And right there, next to where he had been resting, officers found the handgun that had been used to end Wandimu's life just hours earlier. But the true nightmare was still waiting to be uncovered. In the bedroom, underneath a blanket, officers discovered the body of a young woman in an advanced state of decomposition.
When police tracked Moore down across the street inside his apartment, they also made a gruesome discovery: his girlfriend, Denise Middleton, dead, her body mummified.
The remains were so deteriorated that identification would require forensic examination. This was 26-year-old Denise Middleton, Moore's girlfriend, and she had been lying there, forgotten and abandoned, for approximately 2 months while Moore continued to live his life in that very same apartment. The horror didn't end there. The autopsy would reveal something even more heartbreaking. Denise had been 8.5 months pregnant when she died. At 38 weeks, she was carrying a viable male fetus whom her family had already named Ezekiel. This baby boy was just days away from being born, just moments away from taking his first breath, just heartbeats away from meeting his family who had already prepared a name and a future for him. Medical examiners confirmed that the fetus was fully viable and would have survived if delivered, making this not just a double murder, but a tragedy that would resonate through multiple generations of a grieving family.
He was apparently known to police. Court documents show his criminal history includes arrests for armed robbery, having a gun, assault, and kidnapping.
Moore was no stranger to the criminal justice system. He had a long list of violence and disregard for human life: armed robbery, assaults, robbery with a deadly weapon, kidnapping, controlled substance possession with intent to distribute, and carrying a loaded handgun. This was a man who had repeatedly demonstrated that he was a danger to those around him, yet he had remained free to commit the most heinous acts imaginable. But the question that hung heavy in the air, The question that would drive the investigation forward and torment Denise's family for years to come was simple yet devastating. How long had Moore been living with Denise's body? How many days, how many nights, how many ordinary moments had he spent in that apartment, walking past her remains, sleeping just rooms away from the woman he had killed and the son he would never meet? And perhaps most chillingly of all, what had driven him to pull the trigger not once, but multiple times, ending 2 innocent lives in the span of just 2 months? To understand the full scope of this tragedy, we need to rewind the clock and examine the relationship between Tori Moore and Denise Middleton, a relationship that, from the outside, might have looked like any other young couple navigating the complexities of impending parenthood, but behind closed doors was marred by violence, control, and escalating danger that would ultimately prove fatal. Denise Middleton was born on March 14, 1996. At just 26 years old, she was preparing for the most transformative experience of her life, becoming a mother. She and Moore shared an apartment at 11,235 Oak Leaf Drive in Silver Spring, and to casual observers, they might have seemed like any other couple preparing for their first child. But the reality was far darker than anyone could have imagined. In June of 2022, months before her death, Denise had reached out to police in Norfolk, Virginia, with a terrifying account of domestic violence. She reported that Moore had punched her and choked her for 3 agonizing minutes, cutting off her air supply and leaving her gasping for breath, certain that she might die right there. This wasn't a minor altercation or a regrettable loss of temper. This was a sustained, deliberate act of violence that demonstrated Moore's capacity for cruelty and his willingness to hurt the woman who was carrying his child. An outstanding warrant was issued for Moore on aggravated assault charges, but tragically, it would never be served in time to save Denise's life. Defense attorneys would later characterize the relationship as complex and turbulent, suggesting that both parties bore responsibility for the dysfunction that plagued their time together. But here's what we know with absolute certainty. Only one person in that relationship would end up dead, and only one person would pull the trigger that ended 2 lives. The fatal night arrived on October 9, 2022. Surveillance cameras captured Moore and Middleton entering an elevator around 7 o'clock in the evening. What those cameras recorded next would become crucial evidence in understanding the final moments before Denise's death. The footage showed a physical fight erupting between them in the confined space of the elevator, Moore grabbing Denise, pushing her, the violence escalating with each passing second as the elevator carried them upward toward their apartment and toward Denise's tragic fate. They entered the apartment together, but approximately 1 hour later, Moore emerged alone. What happened during that hour remains known only to Moore himself, but the physical evidence tells a story of unimaginable brutality and terror. Denise was shot 7 times, with at least 4 of those shots striking her in the back as she likely tried to flee from the man who was supposed to protect her and their unborn child. Projectiles were later recovered during the autopsy, each one a silent witness to the violence that had unfolded in that apartment. But here's where Moore's actions become even more calculated and chilling. After taking Denise's life, Moore didn't panic, didn't immediately flee, didn't turn himself in or show any remorse. Instead, he made a series of deliberate choices that demonstrate consciousness of guilt and an attempt to evade justice. He traveled to North Carolina and California, spending approximately 26 days away from the apartment while Denise's body lay where it had fallen, slowly decomposing in the bedroom they had once shared. During this time, Moore's phone records revealed a series of disturbing internet searches that paint a picture of a man desperately trying to understand the consequences of his actions and find ways to avoid detection. He searched for phrases like, "How long does it take for a dead body to smell?" and "How to move a dead body without being seen." Questions that reveal he knew exactly what he had done and was actively seeking ways to conceal his crime. He even searched for defenses for murder, suggesting he was already contemplating his legal strategy should he be caught, already preparing excuses and justifications for the inexcusable. Eventually, Moore returned to the apartment. And here's what makes this case so particularly disturbing. He lived there with Denise's decomposing body for weeks. The body had been left under a blanket in the bedroom, deteriorating in an advanced state of decomposition, while Moore carried on with his daily routines, sleeping in the dining room, coming and going as if nothing had happened. How does someone do that? How does someone walk past the body of the woman they once claimed to love, the mother of their unborn child, day after day, night after night, and continue living as if everything is normal. Police would later find Moore sleeping peacefully next to the very handgun he had used to commit his crimes, the weapon lying within arm's reach like some macabre security blanket. It was the same gun that had ended Denise's life, the same gun that had taken their son's future before he even had a chance to draw his first breath, and soon, it would be the same gun used to take yet another innocent life. The question that haunts this case, the question that Denise's father would later pose at a press conference, speaks to the fundamental mystery at the heart of this tragedy. Dennis Middleton, speaking through his grief and seeking some shred of understanding that might make sense of the senseless, said simply, "I'd really like to hear why. Why did Moore kill the woman who was carrying his child? Why did he live with her body for months? Why did he then go on to kill again?"
We have breaking news out of Montgomery County, Maryland. A man has been found guilty of murdering his girlfriend and her unborn child. He is 33-year-old Tory Damian Moore. A jury just found him guilty of murdering 26-year-old Denise Middleton back in 2022, and he's the first in Montgomery County to also be convicted of murdering a viable fetus.
The path to justice for Denise Middleton, her unborn son Ezekiel, and Ayalu Wandimu would be long, complex, and would ultimately make legal history in Montgomery County, Maryland. But it would also raise profound questions about mental health, criminal responsibility, and society's ability to protect vulnerable women from intimate partner violence. Moore was arrested on December 9, 2022, hours after the discovery of Denise's body and his apprehension following Wandimu's murder. Initially, the legal system hit an unexpected roadblock. In late December of 2022, Moore was ruled incompetent to stand trial due to schizophrenia, a diagnosis that his defense attorneys would lean heavily on throughout the proceedings. He was held without bond and committed for psychiatric evaluation, while prosecutors, victims' families, and the community at large waited to see if he would ever face accountability for his alleged crimes. The question of Moore's mental state would become a central battleground in the case. Defense attorneys argued that their client suffered from schizophrenia and mental illness that disconnected him from reality, pointing to his decision to live with Denise's decomposing body as evidence of his detachment from rational thought. They suggested that a person in their right mind could never make such choices, that the very nature of his actions demonstrated profound mental disturbance rather than calculated criminality. But prosecutors saw something entirely different in Moore's behavior. They emphasized his calculated actions, his internet searches about decomposition and moving bodies, his travels to other states, and his ability to function in everyday life despite the horror unfolding in his apartment. These weren't the actions of someone completely divorced from reality. These were the actions of someone who knew he had committed a crime and was actively trying to avoid consequences. By July 26, 2023, Moore's competency was restored, allowing the trials to finally proceed. The legal system had determined that he could understand the charges against him and assist in his own defense, clearing the way for justice to move forward. The first trial came in May of 2024. Moore was convicted of first-degree murder for the killing of Ayalu Wandimu, along with charges for use of a firearm and a felony and illegal possession of a firearm. The convenience store surveillance video, the ballistics evidence linking the gun to shell casings found at the scene, and Moore's own admission during police interviews created an overwhelming case that left little room for doubt. A jury of his peers looked at the evidence and unanimously agreed. Tory Moore had murdered an innocent man in cold blood over a dispute about an iced tea. But it was the second trial that would make history. Between November 18th and 22nd, 2024, Moore stood trial for the murders of Denise Middleton and her unborn child. The evidence presented was as comprehensive as it was damning. The apartment and elevator surveillance footage showing the physical altercation, the phone searches revealing his consciousness of guilt, the autopsy results confirming that Denise had been shot 7 times and that her fetus was viable and would have survived delivery, and the ballistics evidence linking the same gun used to kill Wandimu to Denise's murder. During interviews with police, Moore admitted to shooting Wandimu but claimed he had found Denise already dead when he returned from buying marijuana. He acknowledged choking her a little bit earlier but denied being the one who killed her, despite being pretty positive the same gun was used in both murders. His story strained credulity. If he had truly found her dead, why not call the police? Why travel to other states? Why search online for information about decomposing bodies? Why live with her remains for months? On November 22, 2024, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts. Moore was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for Denise and 1 for her viable fetus, along with additional charges including use of a firearm in a felony, crime of violence against a pregnant person, and illegal possession of a firearm. This marked Montgomery County's first conviction for the murder of a viable fetus, setting a legal precedent that would potentially influence future prosecutions involving violence against pregnant women. The sentencing came on May 30th, 2025, before Judge Rachel McGuckian. In a courtroom filled with the families of the victims, people who had waited years for this moment of accountability, the judge handed down a sentence that matched the severity of Moore's crimes. 3 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each victim, whose life he had taken plus 80 years to run concurrently for the firearm and other charges. Moore would not be eligible for parole until he reaches his 90s, effectively ensuring he would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. Throughout the sentencing hearing, Moore remained silent, offering no explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement of the devastation he had caused. He had nothing to say to Denise's family, who would never hear her laugh again or hold her close. He had nothing to say to little Ezekiel, who would never take his first steps or speak his first words. He had nothing to say to Wundamu's widow, who had described her husband as my everything, and whose world had been shattered by a senseless act of violence. Denise's family, though appreciative of the guilty verdicts and the historic nature of the conviction, still sought answers about Moore's motives. Perhaps there is no explanation that could ever make sense of such senseless brutality. Perhaps some questions are destined to remain forever unanswered because the truth is simply too dark, too incomprehensible for human understanding. Wundamu's widow expressed her profound loss in court, speaking to the hole that would forever exist in her life where her husband once stood. He had been her partner, her companion, her everything, and in a flash of rage over something as trivial as an iced tea, he had been ripped away from her forever. Let me know what you think about this case in the comments section. Click on one of the cards on your screen to see more videos like this.